A reading from Matthew. Jesus said, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward." The word of the Lord. "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me," says Jesus. Speaks of hospitality. And again, I welcome anyone who has joined us from the parish of St. Andrew's in Lake Elsinore. In the summer of 2007, I led a small group of youth on a pilgrimage to Nova Scotia. We were the Journey to Adulthood group from St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Waterville, Maine, where I was the rector. And we were on a journey to find God in the circumstances of our lives. There were 6 youth and 3 adults on this pilgrimage. And it was the second one that I had taken with this parish. The first pilgrimage that we took was to Western North Carolina, which was familiar to me and one of the leaders, and I think a couple of the youth had also been there. But this time, none of us had been where we were going, not even the leaders. Sometimes there's a benefit to checking out the territory ahead of time, but sometimes, especially on a pilgrimage, there's grace in the surprises and discovery of completely new places. So you've probably heard me talk before about the difference between being a pilgrim and being a tourist. So I prepared this group, as I prepare everyone who goes on pilgrimage, to try to live in the present moment. And that's really hard for us as humans. We're mostly thinking about the past or the future. Very rarely are we in the present moment. But on a pilgrimage, that's particularly important. And I encourage them to put aside their expectations, any expectations they might have about how things were supposed to be, so that they could actually experience what was happening in the moment. One of the places that we went on this pilgrimage was a small Russian Orthodox hermitage in the middle of nowhere in Nova Scotia. It was about 2.5 to 3 hours away from where we were staying in Nova Scotia. Very long drive. And our plan for the day was for this group to do a little bit of service work for them, to bring food to share for lunch, which was part of what we were supposed to do as visitors, and then attend their evening Vesper service. We knew that there were only 2 monks in residence at this hermitage. And I have to admit, my expectations of our visit were very modest. I was familiar with the Orthodox Church and knew that they don't allow women priests. I expected to feel excluded. I guess I'll put it that way. That was my expectation, only because of the differences between the Orthodox Church and the Episcopal Church. But I didn't say anything to the youth about that, of course. I wanted the youth to have a wonderful experience. But my expectations weren't very high. Also, I had been to lots of retreat centers and never had a particularly wonderful worship experience there. But this day was a surprise. The day started out good and it got better and better. We met Father Roman, who was the older monk who had established this monastery, and we met a younger monk whose name I don't recall. We all ate lunch together in the dining room, and their rules were no talking during meals, but they would have someone read from one of the sacred books during meals. So one of the monks read to us while we ate in silence. We went out into this beautiful ancient forest, a fragrant forest. You can imagine in Nova Scotia, if you can imagine, was just incredible. And we did a little bit of work on a trail there. But before we went out, Father, I don't remember what I had on my feet, probably sandals or something. And Father Roman insisted that I wear his large yellow rain boots, mud boots, because it was muddy and wet. So I went out there in his boots, which was wonderful. And they called us back in early. We didn't do a lot of work because it started to rain. It was very cold. So we came back in. It was wet. We were wet and cold. And we had a wonderful time of hot tea and conversation with Father Roman. We found out that he was a Russian Orthodox priest from France. He had grown up in France, and yet he was Russian Orthodox. And he was so happy to have us there. He spent several hours talking with us and showing us some of the icons that he had written. When you create an icon, it's called writing an icon. But if you've ever seen an icon, they are painted, but the creation of them is called writing. So finally, it was time for evening vespers, and so we went into their small chapel and stood in silence. The interior of the chapel was all natural pine, and that was beautiful enough in itself. But almost every place on the wall was covered with icons of all sizes. Father Roman had written most of the icons that were all over the wall in this chapel. It was stunning. There was incense wafting in the air. Then the bells began to ring and someone began to chant. The flow of the service, their Vesper service, was familiar to us, but the prayers were very different, and most of the service was chanted, even the readings. It was so beautiful that I actually started weeping. And far from feeling excluded, I felt completely welcomed, even embraced by the whole experience at that hermitage, by the Vespers, by Father Roman. It was one of the most beautiful services I've ever experienced, and there were only 3 people who were leaving it. All of us, including all the youth, these are teenagers, stood for the whole hour and a half of the service without even getting tired or restless. As in the Orthodox tradition, you stand for the whole service. Afterwards, as we drove back to the place we were staying, all of us agreed that we had experienced the most remarkable welcome. Everything that Father Roman did spoke loudly and clearly. Welcome. We are so glad that you are here. So our whole experience was one of genuine welcome and warm hospitality. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, Jesus said. What does it mean to welcome? Well, from that experience at that monastery in Nova Scotia, I learned that to welcome someone in the name of Christ includes genuine concern for their well-being, making a safe space for them to join in as appropriate, interest in getting to know them and what they have to offer, and having reasonable expectations of the visitor. But it's important to note that welcoming does not mean anything goes. Does not mean no rules or no boundaries. There were very clear rules at the Hermitage, which we knew in advance and were asked to follow. If we hadn't followed them, I'm sure there would have been some kind of consequences. We were to bring vegetarian food only. There was no talking during meals. No entering the monks' quarters. We were invited into their liturgy, but we were also asked to stand and to be silent and respectful. And if they had been serving communion, we would not have been able to receive it because we were not Orthodox. So I've been thinking about this extraordinary experience of welcome this week as I looked at this gospel passage. Because of our current status of online worship only, and because of all the things that will be different whenever we are able to have in-person worship. In some ways, it will be similar to being on a pilgrimage in a place that none of us has ever been before. And actually, this time that we're in right now could be seen as a pilgrimage in a space, in a conditions that none of us has ever been in before. The gift of this time, one of the gifts of this time, can be, if we are able to look at it as a pilgrimage, as a spiritual pilgrimage, to shake us out of our usual way of doing things, which it already has done, and invite us to be open to seeing the blessings that are there in the midst of even difficult circumstances. If we can do that, we'll probably have a little bit easier time when we actually are able to get together in some form. Because in some ways, we will all have to relearn the way that we do church. In some ways, it will be more difficult for us than going to a completely different kind of liturgy. It'll be more difficult than it would be to go to an Orthodox monastery and follow all of their rules. Because it's clear then that you're in a separate, different space and there are different rules to follow. We will have our same space, although it'll probably be outside first. But we will have to follow more rules than we had to follow in that Orthodox monastery, that are rules for our safety and for the safety of all people. These rules will feel very foreign to us. All of us will have to wear a face mask and wear it properly. That means over both your nose and your mouth. You can't pull it down underneath your nose because that doesn't do any good at all. We may have to do temperature checks on everybody who comes into the service. We may have to have a reservation system so that we don't have more people than can safely be in our space. We can't greet one another with a handshake or a hug. We can't get within 6 feet of anyone else except people in our own household. We are not able to sing together because singing spreads the virus very far in the air. We can't even say the parts of the service together that we are used to saying together, the psalm, the confession, the creed, etc., because even speaking, everyone speaking together is a way to spread the virus. So we won't be able to do that either. And we won't be able to have any communion, at least for the foreseeable future. So in some ways, that may be more difficult for us than going to a completely different place like we did and following their rules. So again, I encourage all of us to do, maybe it requires maybe a shift in your mindset if you haven't already done this, to think of this time that we're in as a spiritual pilgrimage. You might think of it a little bit like the wandering in the wilderness of the Hebrews, because it feels like we're wandering in the wilderness. And we're waiting for the promised land, but the promised land is going to look different when we get there, at least at first. But if we can look at this, if we can experience this together as a pilgrimage, as a spiritual pilgrimage, and really pray every day to be open to the blessings that are right there in front of us, right in front of our eyes, if we have eyes to see them, then we can deepen our faith in God in these difficult times. Jesus said, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward." So any way that we individually and collectively can give a cup of cold water to someone in these times, know that no good deed is ever lost. All of you who brought food and toiletries on Thursday and are contributing to the community in Hemet, no good deed is ever lost. And in the future, our hospitality, our welcome will be much more difficult and complex. So I pray that in the meantime, that all of us can be open to seeing the blessings that our God gives to us, that are present for all of us, even in the most difficult of times. Amen.